Hi guys, welcome back to the Astro Imaging channel. Tonight's session is going to be an open Q&A because we haven't got a presenter for this week, but people always appreciate it when we try and answer their questions, so that's what we'll try and do this time around. I do want to say we are canceled next week. Some of my support team are on vacation, and I am going to be out of town as well. That said, the following week, the 22nd it is, we have Adam Block coming on, and Adam is going to be presenting on PixInsight. Adam is an accomplished astrophotographer, and basically you will, well, Google him, look at his stuff, you'll be pretty impressed. I have one, I'm going to say this right up in advance, I have one question to start working on right off the bat. So if you want to start throwing some questions in chat, go right ahead. And you can get to our chat from the homepage of our website, theastroimagingchannel.com. It's on the bottom right, and that's where you can watch the show too. But before I go into that, I am going to show off our image of the week, which goes to Jeremy Shear. And my apologies if I'm mispronouncing your name. But Jeremy did a great job on this Cygnus wall. Or what do we call this, kind of the Gulf region, right, in the North American Nebula. Beautiful image, lots of detail, lots of structure in there, pretty nice color, and I always love the way that black dust just looks like it's spilling over into the bright blue nebula. So great job, Jeremy, congrats. And guys, as always, you can submit your images of the week. Just by clicking right there, scan down to the bottom, and you will be able to share. Let me see, where do I go to take my screen back? Right there. Got it. Okay. So to the questioner, I hope you don't mind. I won't mention your name, but I hope you don't mind me answering this on the show. But I do need some questions to start filling up our time. So I'm going to go right ahead and basically read your question. Hi, Adam. I have a basic question on cameras and imaging. What is the definition of long exposure? I've just started with the hobby and currently use a DSLR, a Canon T5i. They are nearing retirement and live in a southern state, so the camera temperature typically heats up to over 90 degrees. To compensate for this, they only shoot 30 to 60-second exposures, albeit many of them. Also to note, my setup is a Celestron Nexstar Evolution mount with a William Optics Zenith Star 61 telescope. Due to the ease of use, I have no desire to upgrade. I'm considering a dedicated imaging camera and trying to determine should the camera be cooled, which, as you know, introduces its own complexities with additional power requirements. I'm trying to determine if a non-cooled model would be justifiably better than the DSLR. Mainly interested in star clusters and very bright nebula. Okay, so there's a lot of questions there. I'm going to go through them one by one, but a few of them are kind of reliant on certain answers, and I know you're not here to have a back and forth, but I'm going to present you with a few different options. First of all, what is the definition of long exposure? To be honest, I can't tell you if there's a 100% certain definition of long exposure, whether it be in astrophotography or not. But I'm going to say once you're over a few seconds, you're taking long exposure photographs. Planetary would be shorter exposure. You're talking milliseconds there, right? Terrestrial, you're talking milliseconds. If you're talking terrestrial photography and you're trying to capture a flowing stream or do some sort of interesting waterfall effect or do some cool effects on grass kind of blowing in the wind, you might take a 1 second exposure. For a terrestrial photograph, I would consider that a long exposure. So what's a long exposure? I don't know, but I'm pretty sure that if you're shooting 30 to 60 seconds, you qualify. That's good enough. So you have a T5i, but you live in a southern state and the camera's heating up to over 90 degrees. So you're shooting shorter exposures. That's exactly what you should be doing. But there's another reason you should be doing that as well with your particular setup. You're using a Nexstar Evolution mount, which is an alt-azimuth mount. So you are not polar aligned. You're going to have field rotation in your individual subs if your exposure goes long enough. So what you need to do is you need to find out at what point that field rotation shows up in your images. I do not know whether 30 to 60 seconds is about the max. To me, it kind of sounds like that's going to be about the max before the field rotation is going to begin to show up, even with that wide field telescope. But you're thinking that that's the max due to the temperature. Thermal noise builds over time, but by taking lots and lots of those exposures, you can adequately deal with thermal noise. So 90 degrees is a lot, though, but I'm not so concerned with that. Now, you threw the big curveball in there. Due to the ease of use, I have no desire to upgrade. So what I'm going to ask you is, are you happy with your results? Are you looking for a big leap forward in image quality? If you were, then I would look to I would look to do some different things to your system, which may involve a cooled camera, but it would probably involve an equatorial mount. That's not easier. Just the camera introduces some complexities. If you're using a DSLR on your Nexstar Evolution mount, I don't know whether you're using a laptop to trigger the exposures, but consider that an added complexity. To go much further, you may want to add guiding. So you're going to have to consider that an added complexity as you continue progressing. So let me answer the question this way. With your current setup, will a cooled, dedicated astro imaging camera improve your images? Yes, it will. It may allow you to push them a little bit further, exposure-wise. It may not, due to the fact that you're not polar aligned, but it will help a little bit. If you were to get an equatorial mount, which would probably, even an equatorial mount that I'm going to say is less expensive than the dedicated cooled astro camera, I think that you would probably see a bigger gain. Even still continuing to use that DSLR, it'll just let you take longer exposures, more exposures with the same field, but at the slight added complexity of having to polar align. And I will say this, I've used an alt-azimuth mount, and there's no substitute for how easy they are, but at the same time, they just are not good at taking long exposure astrophotographs, deep sky astrophotographs. Okay, and the other curveball you threw in there. You're mainly interested in star clusters and very bright nebula. Well, those are the perfect objects to take as a beginner because they don't require long exposures, at least star clusters are. Very bright nebula, well, there's some bright nebula. The Orion Nebula is going to stand out, and probably the top, I don't know, 10 bright nebula out there will stand out as good targets for shorter exposures. But I do look at this hobby, as we discussed milestones last week, that pushing your exposure time longer is really a milestone you want to get beyond. And it takes a lot. It takes, in some cases, a better mount, in some cases, guiding, better polar alignment, better technique, better equipment, more complexity. But depending on how much of an improvement you want, it's hard for me to just give you a yes or no answer to that. Yes, that dedicated imaging camera would probably help a bit, but it may not be. If you were to ask me what should I buy to make my images better, I would suggest something different. If you said I have $1,100, what should I buy to make my images better? I would suggest something different. For a lot of the CCDs, and yes, if you could provide us with some of your images, I would look at them and I would say, oh, you know, okay, you're doing pretty good work with these 30 to 60-second images. There are people using CMOS cameras with very short exposures and taking pretty impressive stuff. They are definitely ahead of the game, ahead of the curve in regards to that, because people are still getting accustomed to these new CMOSs, but they are doing it. So, long-winded answer to your question. I hope I gave you enough information to give you something to work on. There are cases where someone sees a piece of gear and they focus in on that and say, how do I use that piece of gear to make my imaging better? And I always say, take a step back and ask someone, what piece of gear should I be focusing on to make my imaging better? There you go. I see a few questions popping up, so I'm going to move on to the next one. Making a leap from DSLR to dedicated astro camera, pretty good with PixInsight for processing one-shot color data. What am I getting? Sorry about that, my dogs. What am I getting into with LRGB and HA03S2 narrowband processing? How is the PI processing different? So I'm gonna, Jeffrey, I'm gonna ask you a question. When you do your DSLR processing, PixInsight splits the channels, so it spits out RGB images for you that you then recombine and then background neutralize and color calibrate. I'm assuming that's your workflow. If that's the case, your workflow is not going to change much. At least for LRGB imaging, your workflow is not going to change much. For HA03S2, you're going to have to learn a little bit about combining channels. There are tools inside of PixInsight that kind of give you some automation to that, but a lot of us are using PixelMath. You can look back at some of my narrowband processing tutorials. I've done it two ways. I've done my combination linear and nonlinear. You should try them both ways. I think you will, meaning combining the channels linear and combining the channels after stretching to nonlinear. For channels with for images with weak S2 and O3, sometimes I think nonlinear combination is a little bit more beneficial. It helps you stretch out a little bit more of that weak S2 and O3 data. So my answer is it's not so different. You know all of the most difficult stuff. You're not intimidated by PixInsight at this point, but you're going to have to learn 2 or 3 new tools. Comments on what I believe were my... oh, no, I'm sorry. I misread that. Yeah, someone's saying someone switched to a cooled CMOS, ASI 1600 cooled, remarkably better than a DSLR. And yes, I mean, it's a dedicated cooled Astro camera. So your raw subs are going to be that much cleaner. In addition to that, to the person that asked the initial question, are you having difficulty calibrating? When DSLR camera temperatures fluctuate, which they do throughout the evening, one set of darks might not adequately remove the dark current, especially when you're talking about temperatures that high. So are you seeing the noise in your images? Is it coming from the heat? If so, then yes, you will see that much more of a gain. Comment on someone using a Lodestar for guiding, and they think their guide camera is now better than their main camera. And yes, that chip is really impressive.
Hey, Adam.
Yes.
I was going to say, one of the things that people get a little hung up about with the DSLR is the idea that they are inherently easier to use. And I think that they are conceptually easier to use because they're a self-contained box and they seem familiar, and we always use them for snapshots, whereas the dedicated camera seems scary. But most people, unless they're really photographers, don't actually know how to use the built-in features of the DSLR that would allow you to take delays for the images and things like that. So that's something they have to learn. And then the first advice that people usually get for DSLRs is, well, don't trust the battery, hook it into an external power supply, and don't trust don't use the intervalometer. You want to do something more sophisticated. So pretty soon you're kind of using your DSLR exactly as if it was an uncooled, dedicated camera. I think that I'm a big proponent of using what you got, but there's some beauty to be had with using a tool that was really meant for the job. I mean, unless you're going really minimalist and you're camping and you want something that's ultra lightweight and ultra simple. We kind of touched on it with the comments too, but the cooling doesn't just make the chip run cleaner. It actually really does make calibration a lot easier. So you were touching on that as well. I'm sorry, I thought I would just throw that out there while you were reading comments.
No problem. Thank you, Ken. Yeah, that's if I didn't specifically mention that, calibration does get a lot easier because it's set point cooling. So you don't have a dark library of 60 degrees, 50 degrees, 40 degrees, 30 degrees. You have maybe a summer dark library at minus 15 degrees and a winter dark library at minus 30 degrees or minus 25 degrees. And everything you shoot in the summer, you just set it to that point and basically use the same darks. I use the same master dark to calibrate all of my images 6 months out of the year. Probably actually longer than that, about 8 months out of the year.
I do the same.
Yeah. And for me, since I don't even touch my camera, I use flats for months on end. Until some sort of piece of dust makes it in there, I'm using flats for a long, long period of time. I do not shoot them every night in my permanent observatory.
Adam, just to add something, you can't do that with even the cooled CMOS cameras.
No,
they don't scale well. So so yes, you may have constant temperature, but you still have to take, if you have 60-second subs, you need 60-second darks. You can't take 600s and scale them.
Yeah, okay, I get what you're saying.
Yeah, no, that was my experience with my CMOS camera too. That it does fine with a dark and a flat library, but you do have to have matching darks. You can't scale them with a bias.
That's what I meant. Yeah.
You know what? I was referring to the temperature being matched. I do not use dark scaling for time.
Oh, you don't? Okay.
No, no. Even on my CCD. But at the same time, I shoot. I think I shoot 8-minute exposures and I shoot 30-minute exposures. And that's
Right.
about it.
I guess I use scaling with bias for flat frames because I've got all these weird durations for flats through the filters, but I don't use them for real, honest to gosh light frames.
Right. And I'm trying to think about this because even though we don't use scaling, I think PixInsight by what is it in their noise evaluation uses kind of a smarter form of scaling within.
I believe you're right.
Yeah, so I don't use scaling, but PixInsight evaluates the images anyway and does kind of scaling, which actually helps, or at least I think it's part of their secret sauce, so to speak. And I like PixInsight's calibration and integration over some of the other programs I've used.
I will also throw out, since the poster commented about the Lodestar being a great camera, the Lodestar is a great camera. There's a little bit of one reason why people like it for its sensitivity is because they kind of have the gain cranked up on it by default. I guess I was thinking about the gain because when Tolga talked about scaling the CMOS cameras, you always have to make sure that with those calibration frames, everything matches, the gain matches, the offset matches. But in the case of the Lodestar, I was going to say, if you ever are using it for something that's not guiding, like you're taking pictures of something really as pretty pictures, you may feel that it's a little noisy. And of course, you can remove that byproduct of the high gain by using the calibration frames. But also, Terry Platt has a quiet version of the firmware that's available where they crank the gain down a little bit. So it's maybe not as responsive to a dim guide star, but it doesn't, for instance, create that white line on the left-hand margin where the readout is and things like that. So just keep that in mind if you ever do EAA work or something and you want the camera to be a little quieter, you can email Starlight Express and they'll send you a new BIOS and or whatever firmware and you'll flash it.
I didn't know that. I did not see the earlier question. Yeah, use CCDs, excellent deals right now. Watch Cloudy Nights Classified, watch Astromart. I'm a proponent of buying used. I like to buy my gear, use it for a few years, and sell it for just a little bit less than I bought it for. But yeah, if you're willing to buy used, you can buy a lot more gear. And this hobby's expensive enough to have to buy it all new. Yeah, flats. We did a, I think we've done a couple presentations on flats. We've done some in theory. I did one that basically broke down the acquisition method. I did it with a CCD. I don't believe I did it with a DSLR. So I'm not quite sure either which type of camera you're using. What type of system. Depending on a few things, it could be really easy. It could be really difficult. You know, there's lots of stuff out there between our channel and others. I'd really just have to advise you to go there and try and check it out. if you read through an article and give it your first shot and you're having some sort of issue, then come back to us and say, this is the issue I'm having. But there are lots of tutorials out there. Yeah, James, are you talking about dynamic PSF? I don't know, point spread function software in PixInsight? With PixInsight? I am not sure what you're asking there. What is the difference between dark current and thermal noise, or are they the same? Okay, so let me qualify this first of all by saying I might be wrong here, but I think they're basically the same thing. Dark current is basically it's basically okay, so I'm getting here from Adam in the room. Dark current is the rate at which that thermal noise builds up. I think in a sense dark current is just that signal that you don't really want there. Noise, that signal that you don't really want there that's building. Thermal noise thermal frames, which is a good way to refer to it, would be the bias subtracted dark frame. So basically, you know, we refer to it as what the bias takes care of. We refer to darks taking care of thermal noise, flats taking care of uneven illumination. So we basically, we kind of throw a lot of different types of noises together, which is why I at first kind of stepped back and said I might be wrong because I'm not sure about dark current and thermal noise, but they're very, very, very closely related. If not, could be described as basically the same thing. James just saw some graphs of stars using the PSF software. Don't know what the graphs were of. Why would you want to graph the PSF? So I use dynamic PSF for getting the point spread function to do deconvolution in PixInsight. So it basically gives PixInsight and the deconvolution tool a little bit better of an idea of a little bit more information. I'm sorry about that. I think they're going to do that for a while. A little bit more information to kind of deconvolve your data. So I'm not sure what the graph. It doesn't show a graph when you use deconvolution, so I'm just not quite sure. There's a table of info with the computed point spread function, but I don't think you would look at that and say that was impressive. I kind of ignore that and I don't know, just click that camera icon, which creates the average point spread function that I use for deconvolution. Yeah, Ken, thank you. Posted in chat at least one of the tutorials on flats. You know, let me step back to that flat question, because I will say this. Flats used to be really difficult for me, but after I started using a flat panel, an EL panel, it made them a lot easier. I all of a sudden knew that I was getting an even illumination throughout the field. I could plug it into my battery, turn it on, take the shots, turn it off. It was pretty close in illumination from one day to the next, unlike sky flats or t-shirt flats or even light box flats, because if you take a light box flat and it's light out, some light may be leaking into there. That EL panel does a great job of keeping even illumination consistent from night to night. And I had done an episode where I basically showed you how to acquire the parts and build one. And if you're struggling with flats, that is one good place to start, because keep in mind, one of the more difficult parts, issues with using flats is determining the proper exposure. You want to, with the CCD, with my CCD, I want it midway exposed. With the DSLR, you might not quite want to go to midway. You might want it a little bit less than midway. But depending on how bright your light source is, that exposure length is going to be different. So having a light source that's the same brightness every time will make it easier for you to find that proper exposure. Now, my automation software, Sequence Generator Pro, has a routine for determining that exposure, and that makes my job just a lot easier. So if you're using that, you're going to get a little bit more information about it than you would have otherwise. But that, I just wanted to go into that because that'll give you a little bit more information to get started and kind of troubleshoot a little bit. Mark would like to upgrade from a DSLR to a dedicated Astro camera. If he were going to shoot RGB, would a CLS filter work in addition to the filters, or would it be blocking too much of the signal? I don't think stacking a CLS filter with an RGB filter is a great idea. Now, I will say this, depending on the quality of your RGB filters, they will, some will do a better job of cutting out regions where there might be light pollution. In other words, RGB filters have some natural light pollution blocking abilities within them. The CLS filter is only going to cut out certain wavelengths that are associated with those light pollution wavelengths. But stacking filters in general, too much possibility of having some sort of odd reflection or something like a haloed star. I would almost, even if you didn't have it in one set of images, shoot near a bright star and it very likely could pop up.
Hey, yeah, Adam.
Yes.
One thing I found, at one point I did stack an IDAS filter. I had a 2-inch IDAS filter and I threaded it into the nose of the field flattener. And then I had the filter wheel with the standard RGB filters. And what I found was interesting was that by doing that, they increased the FWHM. It was like it added an extra layer, you know, the extra layer of glass in addition to the transmission, in addition to the filtering. It may prevent you from getting quite the sharpness that you would get normally. I found that it didn't matter so much when I was shooting a big pixeled camera on a small telescope because I had a large image scale. But when I later moved up to a more or a higher resolution rig, you could definitely see a difference in the FWHM that I consistently got out of the rig. So I guess I would agree with you that I probably would advise not to do that.
Yeah, and that's interesting because the IDAS is a good quality filter, and I wonder if
I later switched to using a 1 1/4 inch IDAS, which I put in the filter wheel and I alternated. I kind of used it as an alternative to luminance. So I would shoot RGB through the normal filters, and then for luminance, I could either shoot through the luminance filter or I could shoot through the IDAS. Now the IDAS filter does put a little bit of a color cast on it, but you can fix that with color balancing without a big deal. But I still found that consistently the IDAS filters FWHM was not as good. And it wasn't as the luminance. And it wasn't just the offsets that I used. I could go focus on that filter and then shoot some images with it. Then I would focus on luminance. And I did a back-to-back. And I found that sometimes the difference between the IDAS filter and the Astrodon luminance was like 1 arc second difference in FHWM. And so it was kind of like I could appreciate that it was knocking some of my light pollution down, but I wasn't willing to take a loss of resolution in the very channel that I wanted the highest resolution, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting.
I mean, I would just overlay the transmission curves of the filters and see where they're passing and where they're blocking. And like, for instance, in green, so most light pollution filters block green light, right? So if you use that with a green filter, stacked green filter, it's gonna be blind. The camera's gonna be blind, pretty much. I would think. And then stacking on top of that, the stacking filters, you're just cutting down on your transmission, because each filter has a maximum transition, whatever it is, like 80%, 90%, but you're losing 10% light each filter. And if you stack 2 pieces of glass, you're losing that transmission plus that transmission. So I don't know if it's, I don't think there is any advantage to it.
Yeah, and the transmission also will vary with wavelength. So you might have further issues than just it could introduce a few different issues. Stacking, bad idea. Just I would if you had your filters stacked and you had any sort of issue, it would be the first thing I would look at. But yes, a lot of people commenting that using your light pollution as your luminance in your filter wheel allows you to take that luminance. I'll tell you, when I bought my Astrodon RGB filters, what I was really looking forward to was the what I had heard. They do a better job of cutting out the light pollution. So I don't use a luminance. I use just the RGB, and I make a synthetic luminance from those. And I believe because of the quality of the filters, I'm then taking advantage of their natural light pollution reduction. And even better, I don't have to spend an extra $800 on a filter wheel that holds 3 additional filters, 4 additional filters, narrowband and that luminance.
That's the best thing to do, Adam. You're doing I think you're doing the best way.
Mm-hmm.
If you're shooting from light pollution, it's probably better off not taking the L and doing the synthetic L out of the RGB, because you're taking those anyways. Might as well shoot. Just keep shooting with the RGB.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, or use lots and lots and lots of L's and then take advantage of PixInsight's gradient removal to try to patch things up on the back end.
I mean, when I was shooting from New Jersey, the L was just not possible. Like you couldn't shoot anything. 30 seconds was it.
And L filters, the gradients are absolutely ridiculous in any sort of light pollution, and I'm pretty bad here. Sorry, I'm just clicking on the link to see what. Oh yeah, CLS CCD filter unmounted. Yep. Any other questions coming in? What about dual narrowband filters to replace the L? Or is that just silly? dual narrowband filters to replace the L. I don't quite know what you're asking, Mark.
Maybe dual narrowband filters to replace the lens cap.
No, he's talking about these new new
Oh, yeah,
light
the
pollution
combination.
filters, that dual band light pollution filters. They're like on HA and O3 at the same time.
Oh, okay. So I've heard of the one that was like triple wavelengths, which was like
a few companies started making these. These basically are, like I said, it's like a dual narrowband filter. It's like an O3 and an HA filter combined. It passes both, but it doesn't pass anything in the middle. Taking that and using L, I guess you could do that for an image like the Veil, which is strong in oxygen and strong in hydrogen. You could do that, but then why not just you're going to take the HA and the O3 anyways. Why not just take them?
All right. You know what I'm going to say, Mark? Your question is going to lead into what Jeffrey's asking right now. Can we say a little bit more about the synthetic luminance, which is basically instead of shooting LRGB, you shoot just RGB, and you combine those RGB frames to create a synthetic luminance. Basically, if you're used to LRGB processing, and you're more comfortable processing your luminance separate than your RGB, then at I'm trying to think at what point in your workflow you do your channel combination if you're using PixInsight. Hoping, Jeffrey, you're using PixInsight. If you do channel combination, and then you can extract the L. You're basically just extracting the luminance from your channel combined image. Now let me think about this. You may there's a million ways to do it. It depends on where in your workflow you pull out that, whether you process your luminance from linear all the way up to nonlinear and then combine, or not. But basically, Jeffrey, synthetic luminance is just combining your RGB and then stripping out the luminance from the image using channel extraction, lab mode, check the L, uncheck the AB, and you can pull it out that way. Depending on see, with PixInsight, a lot of the tools can work in luminance or RGB, even without stripping those channels apart. So you might not even need to make that synthetic luminance. You can work on the luminance without actually stripping the luminance out of the image. But if you're coming at it from the workflow where you used to use LRGB, then it might make a little bit more sense for you to strip out the luminance and work on them individually. When I started, I would work on them individually. Actually, when I started, I was trying LRGB because that's what you did, right? And the more I read, the more it seemed to me that RGB only would make a lot more sense. So in Photoshop, you might put in the channels and then transform to lab. PixInsight, we use lab mode. I shouldn't say that. PixInsight, you're not really using lab mode. You're just using a tool that extracts the L. And since the L is associated with lab mode, I think it kind of came from that. But in Photoshop, if you wanted to strip out, that would probably work.
Adam, I think there's a fundamental question that's being missed. If you're in a location where you can't do luminance because of gradients, then synthetic luminance will work just fine. If you're in a situation where you can do luminance, you're always better off, and you'll always get more detail by shooting L. And it's significantly different. I've done it both ways, and if you can shoot luminance, you're going to extract out much more detail from that image. There's also another issue where I am here in Chicago, I can't shoot RGB no matter what I do. It's all a mess. So you have to decide whether you're in a location where you're going to have to be restricted to narrowband, or whether you really can effectively do an RGB image.
Mm-hmm. And you saying it that way, maybe I should also point out one other benefit of using luminance. You can actually get better signal-to-noise ratio in that luminance in less time, because by only shooting luminance, or I should say, by shooting a larger portion of luminance and only shooting a few RGB subs, but only using those RGB subs for color, which doesn't really require the longest, best quality images. Basically, with RGB and a good luminance, you only need a little bit of RGB.
Well, let me just add to that. That should absolutely be your capture strategy. You shoot luminance until you plateau off, and you're not getting an effective increase in the SNR by accumulating more. And then you shoot, I don't want to say the minimum amount of RGB, but really that's all you need in order to get that color background, and then layer over the luminance issue. And that will give you your best issue. But you're still faced with the question of, can I legitimately shoot RGB images from where I am? And even if I'm in an area which I kind of can but can't do luminance, then in effect you're going to go with the synthetic luminance. But that's a decision you make before you decide about a synthetic luminance. And you're absolutely right. Your luminance has at least 3 times the photons coming in from either the R, G, or B. So you get much more detail, much better SNR by luminance than you ever will by combining R, G, and B.
And if you're trying to dig out some really deep stuff, if you're trying to go deep, luminance is the way to go. When the image I'm most proud of, I would not be able to pull it up quickly in here, but it's a collaboration I did with Josh, VDB 152. Basically, we wanted to pull out the H alpha region, the H alpha. I think it's a supernova remnant, but just kind of streaking across the image. Dark dust in front of it with a reflection nebula at the tip of the dark dust, and then a planetary nebula in the bottom right. But I shot luminance to get the dark dust out. I shot H alpha to pull out the H alpha. I shot RGB to get some of the green on the planetary nebula. But it took the, I don't know, I think Josh and I had about 80 to 100 hours in on luminance on this image.
The one more thing you can do, and I don't necessarily recommend it, but depends on your data, you can combine your RGB with your luminance, and you can weight your RGB data, and if you're going for the absolute maximum amount of SNR, that can work. You do have to weight them, because otherwise you'll end up with some artifacts in there that you won't like. But if you have 20 hours of L and you have 15 hours of RGB, you might as well do some kind of combination to get the maximum luminance layer in the end and the maximum detail out of the image.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you got the data, you might as well use it.
Yeah, on a similar note, I used to use a technique kind of like what you do, Adam, but I actually shot just RGBs that I devoted purely to turning into luminance. So I shot R's, G's, and B's. I made an RGB out of that. And then I shot more RGB, which I then turned into the synthetic luminance as you did. And so the beauty of that was that you got a really clean luminance channel, and it was independent data from the RGB channels that you were using for color. So you got, I think, you got a nice signal noise ratio in that regard. The problem with it, and I was publicly shamed for this on cloudy nights, but it was horribly inefficient because, you know, you are only using a fraction of all that light. And so I think in the end now, even though I'm like 2 miles from downtown Denver, I do shoot luminance and I just noise reduce it and try to do what I can with gradients.
Yeah. We mentioned this last week, but we were talking about gradients, and some people, it's just the way it is. Some people are going to be better at processing and better at getting rid of gradients than other people. And they may just be able to take a really poor luminance image and make it work. I think the comment was, well, you don't need to use a light pollution filter. You just shoot luminance and take care of the gradient. Well, easier said than done. R, G, and B is L. It will not minimize light pollution gradients, if you may disagree. So yes and no. The filters we use themselves cut off regions of known light pollution regions. So when we're combining the RGB to that L, when we're making that synthetic L from the RGBs using these filters, the light pollution regions have not been captured. So that in and of itself reduces those gradients. So it's not like we are actually capturing 100% of everything within the R region, then 100% of everything within the green region, then 100% of everything within the B region. And that's where you can utilize these filters, light pollution, natural light pollution reduction, by taking those, by shooting RGB for the synthetic L. Hopefully that makes sense. Yeah, I saw something on binning. Still an argument for taking luminance 1 by 1 and RGB at 2 by 2 when oversampled, and it's a time saver. Yeah, I'd agree with that. If you're taking a luminance, put tons of effort into that. If you're taking RGB, sure, you can bin it to try and save a little bit of time. As Eric and I were saying before, though, really if you're taking a luminance and putting your effort into that, it takes very little time to get enough RGB data to really make a nice image. You're going to end up mutilating the RGB, but then you're going to overlay it over your luminance, and it's going to look brilliant.
You know, I would agree. I mean, basically, narrow band's a different issue, but for RGB, there's usually plenty of light available, and there's no sense in bidding it. I can't see where it really is much advantage. I mean, you're generally going to, if you can put in a couple hours of R, G, and B for each filter, you got plenty of data on any target I can think of right now. And I mean, that's a night. So I think that should probably be your strategy rather than bidding it.
Yeah, Jeff, from a dark site, definitely capture L. It'd be your most efficient use of time. And that's another thing is, don't underestimate efficiency. We don't get enough clear skies here. You drive to a dark site and it gets cloudy. You go on a weekend camping trip for 3 nights, and if you get 1 night, you're lucky, right? So don't efficiency when you're imaging is almost the important thing. That's why automation is almost that much more important. 30 subs in a night is good, but 35 subs in a night is better. And take 10, 15, 20 nights, and that might be a whole extra image. Renan, I cannot answer that question. I'm not sure typical noise values to expect from a master light. And I don't know if the values would be the same between cameras, so I'd be afraid to just open it up and try and give you a reading. I would need one of my more proficient PixInsight people to answer that, but I don't know if anyone in the room can. If they can, they're welcome to. Hyro has a modified Rebel T3i, very sensitive to H-alpha. What will happen if he adds the dual narrowband filter to it? Example, SI and O3. Well, so you've modified your camera. You've made it more sensitive to H-alpha. You haven't made it any less sensitive to SI and O3. So you haven't made it any worse for acquisition. I think the dual narrowband filter would I don't know. I think it would probably give you the results that your camera's capable of. If you're happy with your now, one thing to really keep in mind is if you're happy with your H-alpha, you shoot up at Cygnus and you're blown away by how much cleaner it is. Don't expect that from S2 and O3. They're very, very weak signals, and it's possible that on many, many targets, a DSLR just might not be sensitive enough to pull that weak signal off of the background sky, or the amount of exposure time required might be so long that you just might not do it. But on an object that's brighter, you haven't made your camera any worse to it by modifying it to be more sensitive in H-alpha. Now, put an H-alpha filter on there, put an H-alpha O3 filter on there, and you're going to get some impressive stuff. But I don't know. And you know what? I'm speaking in theory right now because I have no experience with any of these filters. I've seen no results. So I don't really. I'm speaking. How would I say? I have no experience with it, but I did stay at a Holiday Inn last night, and maybe I'll leave it at that. How is the best way to set up Horizon? The Horizon using ADC on a gem. ADC. I'm sorry, I don't know what ADC is. Sorry. DYFI Astro. I can't answer that question. Send me an email or elaborate on it, and I'll try and do it. I do see that we've gone on for an hour, so I do want to basically thank you all for coming. Like I said, we are canceled next week. We are canceled next week. But the following week, Adam Block will be on to cover PixInsight and ADC, atmospheric dispersion correction, or corrector. I have no idea. and I'm not even going to touch it because
Yeah, we're mostly deep sky imagers, and that's more a question for a planetary imager.
Mhm.
I don't know the answer unless somebody else knows.
And it's so specific. How do you set it up? I would assume it's gear specific. It's not an easy question to answer. Like I said, guys, thank you. I'm going to save some of these questions for our next open session, but we'll see you guys again in 2 weeks. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to submit your images of the week, and I hope that you have some clear skies and some mild weather. Let's not go back to those. It was crazy hot last week, right? Good night. Clear skies.